today's event, Bridget's Gambit. It's by Craig Harwood. Please turn off your video, microphone. This event is being recorded. Use chat for asking questions, which I hope you'll do that at the end. Thank you. Today's event is sponsored by the Saratoga Historical Foundation. The mission of the Saratoga Historical Foundation is to preserve the rich history of Saratoga for the education and enjoyment. Come to the museum and enjoy a 1904 building with information about Saratoga's history, in addition to a permanent exhibit. See a furnished 1850s pioneer cottage. Come inside for a one-room schoolhouse and take your photo and sit in our 1904 interurban passenger stop. And we also have a new blacksmith exhibit. Join us for our lecture series, Patrick History by Connie Young Yu, historian and author, on April 22nd. Lecture is on Zoom. South Bay Flashback, History of Rock and Roll, Bill Gardino and Brian Conroy at the Foothill Club in Saratoga. For more events, go up to www.saratogahistory.com. Be sure to join our email list. The lecture series is recorded and will be posted on our website. Thank you. So Craig Harwood is an accomplished author who co-authored The Quest for Flight, as well as author of other articles. He has been in engineering geologic for 35 years. Now here's Craig.
So, the main character in my book, Bridget Evoy, was my great-great-great-grandmother. And as I was growing up as a child, I used to hear through family history stories, I used to hear about her and her daughters, who were really fascinating people and led really interesting lives. And I was intrigued by this. So as an adult, I decided, in my work, I do a lot of research and I do a lot of writing as well. And which I really enjoy doing both. I love the detective work of doing research, and I love putting together a story to meet that research. So as an adult, I decided to take on this story about 5 years ago, and I had been researching it off and on to sort of fill in the gaps because I knew family story anecdotes passed down mainly by my mother and grandmother, and so I tried to fill in all the empty spaces between these stories and put Bridget's story all together, and about 4 years ago, I tackled the task of writing about her and putting her story together. So the book Bridget's Gambit just came out about 4 weeks ago, and it's doing pretty well so far. And I'm just starting to do a series of talks. So Bridget was born in 1791 in rural Ireland, in the southern part of Ireland, County Wexford, in a small village called Rosegarland. The village was on a large manor, about 650 acres, and pretty common situation where you had these wealthy landowners who they were essentially absentee landowners, and they leased out portions of their property to peasants, working class Irish families who would raise crops, they'd raise animals. They were self-subsisting, and but the arrangement was that they would cultivate a certain amount of crops, and then it would be sold oftentimes overseas. Over time, it was decided by landowners and by the government that they should encourage the growth of potatoes, the cultivation of potatoes, because they preserved well and they shipped well. So this was something that was convenient for the property owners and the politicians to help run this rural economy. However, one thing that left the peasants vulnerable was the fact that these potatoes, if they got, as a monoculture, and so these potatoes, if they developed any kind of disease, it would wipe out a large percentage of the crop. So this was a real problem. Let's see here. the Irish peasants typically would live in these primitive stone, or in some cases, sod houses, dirt floors with a hearth in the middle to keep warm. So this photo shows two households, and it was very common for more than one generation to live in a household. You might have two or three. So in this case, we probably have three generations per house, and they have two houses side by side. So real crowded and a kind of a primitive lifestyle. But the children would, of course, as they grew up, they would contribute to the family economy, and they'd learn how to take care of animals. They'd learn how to take care of crops, and they'd help cultivate. And of course, they collected eggs, milk, and all of that, and sheep's wool. They'd help shear the sheep. So the children were they were given a rudimentary education, but they certainly were expected, despite having to go to school, they were expected to contribute to the family economy and do certain tasks every day. And in the case of this family, the Evoys were Irish Catholic. So in this area of Ireland, the Catholics suffered like they did in other parts of the world because of religious attitudes. And so the Catholics weren't allowed to go to public schools. So what they did is they held informal schools within their homes or within their little villages. And so that's how the Catholic kids got their education. And certain times of the year, they of course would be absent because it might be harvest time or planting time. And like in the spring's planting time and the fall's harvest. So they would miss a certain amount of school. So they made up for that by these homeschools. And this is the way Bridget and her siblings were raised. Um, so in doing this research, I was surprised to find that, everybody knows about the Great Irish Potato Famine in the mid 1840s, when tens of thousands of Irish immigrated to other parts of the world. But there were a couple of phases of potato famine that preceded this in 1817 and again in 1822. Not as severe, but still on a smaller scale, the same impact. The crops were wiped out, and that impacted everybody. And if people fell behind on their rents, they were evicted, and they really had no place to turn to except for the charitable help from their fellow working class folks in Ireland. So it was pretty grim. So a lot of people decided the government, their solution to this was essentially to propose the idea of immigration. So essentially, as a peasant, you were on your own, and solving your own problems was going to be a matter of just going elsewhere. And tens of thousands of Irish did do this. So the Bridget, about 1820, she married a man named James Evoy, also a fellow Catholic, and they began to have children. Over the next several years, they had four children. And by about 1827, they came to the decision that they're going to have to move, they're going to have to immigrate to America to create any kind of opportunity at all for their family. It was just too grim to stay there. And they didn't feel like their children deserved this. So they were going to have to look for a better life. So James went ahead of time, late 1827, uh, took the trip across the Atlantic, and he settled in the Missouri frontier just outside of St. Louis. Somehow he found the money, scraped together to buy some land, which the American government was encouraging people to go out and settle in the western frontier. So they offered a very, very inexpensive acreage. You could get 160 acres for a song and a dance. But the hard part was doing the hard work of cultivating and trying to get some crops to grow, and that was how they subsisted. So in 1828, Bridget stayed back. James came over 1827. Bridget stayed back in Ireland and was taking care of her children. She was living with her family, and she was pregnant when James left, and so she had should say her second to last child, Ellen, in April of 1828. And shortly after that, she gathered her children together, boarded the schooner, and took the transatlantic crossing to America, met James, and then they headed out to the Missouri frontier and settled on their on their farm and began to cultivate crops for a living. James and Bridget also, interestingly enough, started doing real estate transactions in St. Louis with some prominent citizens. James Kingsbury was one of them. William Christie was another. These were moneyed, I believe, Irish um, um, real estate moguls. And so they, by the way, in this period of time, the Victorian era, women were discouraged in a lot of areas in society from acting independently of their husbands as far as doing business deals and entering into contracts and, for example, bringing suit against people. And so the husband had control over all the financial decisions. And then, of course, socially, there were certain constraints as well. So there was a lot of pressure put on women to fit the mold and stay within that mold. But Bridget, even as a married woman, as soon as she arrived in America, started joining her husband in these real estate transactions. So she was proactive and very interested in doing this kind of stuff. So, growing crops, but also doing the occasional real estate transaction. In 1830, they'd only been here for what, a year and a half. James contracted pneumonia and he passed away. And so Bridget now had 5 children. She was widowed, and here she was in St. Louis. She had a farm to run, and her children were really small at this point still. I think her oldest child was 9 or 10 years old. And so this what must have been a really, really difficult situation for her to find herself in. Um, Very, very difficult. And the St. Louis, although it was a fairly good sized town, I think the population was about 5,000 people in 1830. Um, it was subject to the ebb and flow of people coming through, traders, trappers. There were military groups that came through, and everybody would use St. Louis as a place to prepare to enter what they called the Indian Territory, which was the whole part of the United States west of the Mississippi River. So all these people would get outfitted in St. Louis and they'd head out into the western frontier and trappers and traders, as I said. So the economy kind of ebbed and flowed, and I don't think that the real estate market was particularly good in St. Louis. And certainly living off farming was a meager existence as well. So, but nevertheless, Bridget persevered, and over the next 20 years, she raised her children into adulthood. She was the family matriarch. She never considered getting married. And a lot of people in her position, women who were recently widowed, would have preferred to remarry if they could arrange it. And that there was a lot of pressure to do that so that they could gain some financial stability, and especially somebody who's raising 5 children. I think that almost anybody in that position would have tried to remarry. But Bridget decided not to. She wanted to do this on her own. She was 39 years old when her husband died, so she was a mature adult and may have figured that she'd, could somehow get by on her own, and she did. So 20 years went by, and in 1848, gold was discovered in California. So I got ahead of myself a little bit on my narrative. There's the ship she took. And then here we are in St. Louis. It's just some nice little visuals. So 1848, they discovered gold in California, and then the news hit the telegraph service, and it was everywhere, all of the newspapers. Everybody was talking about it, a huge deal across the country, and in fact, in other parts of the world. Um, and a lot of people got excited, and they, by the time the news hit, it was in the fall of 1848. It was too late to take the overland trail to California, which would have taken months and subject to weather and all of that. Some people took a ship, which was very expensive to do, so they got ahead of the game. But most people who intended to go the overland trail route would have to wait till the following spring when the rivers started to flow less hard, so you could cross the rivers. because there were no bridges. And it was essential that the grass, it had to be late enough this spring that the grasses started growing in the prairies, because the oxen and the mules who were pulling their wagon trains would have to have fuel, which was the grass. And these animals supplied the power for this whole operation. So it was essential for the timing, to wait for the right timing, about May of 1849, when everybody started heading out from the trailheads at St. Louis. So Bridget and her group, her adult sons and daughters, all joined this long migration toward California. Um, it was, most people, there were some guidebooks that had been published, there were some maps. They weren't very good. A lot of it was based on speculation and rumor, a lot of sketchy information. The maps were pretty poor quality for the most part. So heading out into this Trans-Mississippi West was like heading into the great unknown for a lot of these people. Even people who were farmers really didn't know what they were getting into. They didn't know exactly what to pack. The guidebooks sort of gave rough information, but a lot of people overpacked. They were way too ambitious on what they wanted to bring. The Evoy group, apparently, from what I understand, I realized in hindsight, intended to come out and settle in California and not just come out and get some gold and go back home. A lot of people did intend to come out, get as much gold as they could, and then head back home, but not the Evoys. They were in it for the long haul. So that was their plan. Um, really difficult. You see a lot of these movies and old TV shows and all, and they make this overland trail adventures seem to be kind of quaint and folksy. You always have the music playing in the background, and it's sort of like Little House on the Prairie, I guess. It was actually really stark reality once they got out there and people started realizing this wasn't what they really thought it was going to be like. They started shedding a lot of their belongings in order to spare their livestock, because the livestock was pulling these wagons. They realized pretty quickly what was essential versus what was not, and they just would shed things along the trail. So as they walked along the trail, you could see just an endless stream of supplies, furniture, God knows what, wrought iron stoves, musical instruments, and all kinds of frivolous items that people had attempted to bring. So the Evoy group, when they reached what they call the parting of the ways, which is about where the Continental Divide was, you're about a third to a half the way through the Overland Trail. There was one fork that headed toward the Salt Lake settlement. And if you had a little bit of money, and if your livestock were getting weak and maybe you're running out of supplies, you could take a side trip down to the Salt Lake settlement and resupply and rest and maybe trade out some livestock for some fresh ones. A lot of people just stayed on the main trail and roughed it out, but the Evoy group decided to take the side trip down to the Salt Lake settlement so they could replenish their livestock and get maybe some fresh food, because at the Salt Lake settlement they were growing vegetables. So this is what they decided to do. They stayed there for about a week, and they made friends with some a Mormon family. One woman in particular made friends with both Bridget and her daughter Ellen. And so at the end of their stay, there was some discussion. There was another fork in the road at the Salt Lake settlement. You could either head to the south, which would take you toward the Mojave Desert to Southern California ultimately, and then you could come up through the Central Valley and hit the Motherlode region. The other fork in the trail went to the north, cut to the north, went up along the side of Salt Lake and joined the main California Trail again. So this big detour that they took to Salt Lake represented maybe a 2 to 2.5 foot, or I'm sorry, a 2 to 2.5 week long side trip. And it took up a lot of time that was valuable. Um, So there was some discussion amongst this group on the last night there at the Salt Lake settlement. Which way are we going to go? A lot of people decided they wanted to take the southern route toward the Mojave Desert. That evening, this Mormon woman who was who made friends with Bridget and her daughter pulled them aside and said, "Look, you don't take the southern route. It's dangerous. Don't tell anybody I told you this, or I'll be killed." So there was something really nefarious going on there. Bridget wasn't quite sure exactly what it was, but she decided to take the woman's advice. But she couldn't divulge this information directly to her group. So what she did is the next morning, when they were getting ready to go, she announced that she decided she was going to take the northern route to go back up to join the main trail. And anybody who wanted to join her was welcome to do it. She tried to encourage people to join her. And of course, her family were going to follow her. But she was going to lead this group. And so about half the people decided to join her and follow her. And about half the group decided to take the southerly route toward the Mojave Desert. Fast forwarding, a long time later, she found out that the southern group were attacked by a group of men who were dressed as Indians somewhere south of the Salt Lake settlement. I'm not sure where. And only one man survived, and he made it eventually to California. And he ran into Bridget later, and he told her of this harrowing story. So the group narrowly missed this situation by taking the opposite direction. So they followed Bridget toward the north, and it joined it was by the way, a brutal, really rugged trip going along the east side of Salt Lake and coming back up into the main California trail. Took them about a week to do that. And it took a hard toll on everybody, including their livestock. They joined the California Trail and they headed down into, by now they were in the Basin and Range province. And everybody who, by the time they reached the Basin and Range, which would have been about where you come into Idaho and in the northern part of Nevada, everybody by this point in time was in pretty bad shape. Their cattle were weak. They were a lot of them were suffering various illnesses and malnutrition, and a lot of people were struggling. And of course, in the Basin and Range, you were subject to full exposure to the sun, to the heat, and there was very little water. What little water they did run across was often contaminated with salts, and so it was you'd get sick drinking it, and the cattle would get sick. So by the time these people hit the Basin and Range, a lot of them were kind of in survival mode, and they knew this is what's crucial about this overland trip is they knew that they had to cross the Sierra Nevadas before winter set in. Now, this is only 2 years after the Donner Party tragedy, and everybody who took the Overland Trail in 1849 was well aware of the Donner Party story. It was infamous and it circulated widely throughout popular American culture. And so that was the thing that was bothering everybody who was in the Basin and Range. They knew that they had to keep moving and they had to keep their pace up because they had to cross the Sierras before, say, roughly late October. Once you get into November, it gets too dicey with the weather. And even if they don't get rain and snow, it gets very cold. The water freezes, and it just makes everything much more difficult. Mainly, they want to avoid the snows, though. So, a quote from the book, their family and their overland comrades were all too aware that somewhere just beyond the horizon, the formidable snowy range awaited them. As as the mountains drew nearer, the anticipation of that encounter taunted them in their daytimes and haunted their anxious nights. The Sierras were looming on the horizon, and they knew that they were going to have to cross them. So by the time the Evoy group were getting closer to the Sierras, it was getting late in the year. They'd used a lot of time on their side trip, so now they're getting into late September, early October, and it's starting to look pretty sketchy for their cross. It looks like it's going to set them in the mountains late October, which they really wanted to avoid. As they headed out, I should say, back up for a minute. as they reached the middle of Nevada, there was another fork in the trail. One direction went toward the traditional routes, the Carson route and the Truckee route over the Sierras, which were high and rugged. And there was another new fork that had been established called the Lassen route, established by Peter Lassen just the year before. And the Lassen route, the claim was that it was it was kind of a shortcut, and it led to a much lower elevation mountain crossing where you're less likely to get a lot of snow. Although you're going to have to go way to the north to take that crossing over the Sierras. So the Evoy group, their cattle were getting weak, and they really didn't think they were going to be able to handle the steep mountain crossings such as the Truckee or the Carson, given the shape of their cattle. And of course, it was crucial that they get their cattle over because all of their belongings, everything was in their wagons. And if they had to drop their wagons, then everything else was going to be on foot. Everything you could carry that you owned, you're going to bring into California was going to be carried on your back. They had to avoid that at all costs. So they took the Lassen Trail, believing that this was going to be easier and a good solution. They headed up through the Black Rock Desert, which was a brutal experience. They had to travel at night because of the heat, and in the daytime, they would sleep underneath their wagon to try to stay out of the sun. There was no shade anywhere, no water. There were occasional hot springs, which didn't help. And some of those had a lot of salts in them, so the cattle would get sick, the people would get sick. So they had to conserve their water and their food in order to make it to the Sierras. At one point in northern Nevada, they came to a place called High Rock Canyon. And this was a kind of a labyrinth of canyons. And at one point, they came to another fork in the trail within this High Rock Canyon region. And there was some talk about which fork they should take, and it wasn't clear. So they took what they thought was the most logical one, and it led to a whole day of traveling through this really rough terrain. It was exhausting, really spent their livestock and the people, absolutely exhausting. And by the end of the day, they came to what you call a box canyon. It was a dead end against a high mountain. No way to get out of there other than to backtrack. And this was incredibly distressing to them because they were really exhausted. They weren't even sure if they were going to be able to backtrack out of this very difficult situation. So Bridget, at this point, stepped forward and took charge. And she said, look, let's prepare a dinner and get some food in us. And we'll then turn around and we'll go back to the original trailhead, the original fork in the road that we'd taken at the beginning of the day. And then we'll take the other fork. And so they did this, and they got back to the original fork and they headed in the other direction. And this led up to well, not technically, it wasn't the Sierra Nevadas. It was a mountain range called the Warner Range, which is just on the north of the Sierra. But nevertheless, it was a high mountain pass they were going to have to get up and over with their weakened livestock. They get up to the top. I should back up for a sec. So their expectation and everybody else's, as they're taking this whole overland trail, was that when they get to the top of the Sierras, that was the goal. If they could get up there, they knew that it was all downhill from there, and they would be just a couple days travel from the Sacramento Valley. So they could get it, whatever condition they were in, it was a matter of just sticking it out for a couple more days, maybe 20, 30 miles, something like that, get into the Sacramento Valley, and they would be safe and they could recover and get replenish their supplies and get into the gold country. When they got to the top of the mountain pass, they met some other travelers and some government, some cowboys had been paid to go up and rescue a lot of these people who had gotten stuck on this trail late in the winter. This is late October, actually, and the weather was starting to turn, and the government, the military authorities in Sacramento were really deeply concerned about the fact that all these people are heading into the Sierras really late in the season. A lot of them are in very poor shape. There had been a lot of deaths, and the livestock were dying by the hundreds. And so people were going to they're going to lose all their belongings. They're going to have to hike the rest of the way in. So the people who were made it up to this pass were finding all of this information out. It was, instead of being a couple days travel to the Sacramento Valley, it was going to be more like 4 weeks. And it was an incredibly rugged terrain, the Modoc Plateau area, right where the Modoc Plateau, the Northern Sierras, and the Cascade Mountains all come together. Really rugged region. They were going to have to spend, it was about 180 miles, about 3 or 4 weeks before they even hoped to get to the Sacramento Valley. So this must have been incredibly, just a huge blow to their confidence and to their whole frame of mind. So they also found out that a local Indian tribe, the Pit River Indians, had the habit lately of going after the livestock. So as the immigrants would come down the main trail through this terrain, the Indians would come in at night and take their cattle. And so if the cattle didn't die of their own poor health and leave the people stranded, then the Indians were doing this as well. And I should point out that it wasn't all the tribes in the region who were doing this. It was specifically the Pit River Indians who decided to do this. It was late in the season. They were hungry too. And they saw all these people coming through with this cattle as an opportunity to get beef on the hoof. So this is what they were heading into. Excuse me. This is what they were heading into as they faced this, roughly 180 miles toward the Sacramento Valley. I can't see the edge of my screen here, so I'm interpreting what this text says. A quote from the book: "The territorial government rescue effort in this unfolding humanitarian crisis. These government-funded cowboys essentially went up this trail against the flow of traffic, and they brought all kinds of cattle with them. They brought flour, they brought raw bacon, and probably coffee as well. But the main thing is they were bringing food up to help anybody who was literally starving, and some of them were. And they also, one of the main goals of sending these cowboys up there was to encourage everybody to drop their wagons, leave them behind, gather whatever they could on their backs, and get through the mountains, because the weather was changing quickly. They were starting to get lots of rainstorms in the Central Valley, and it was looking like the temperatures are dropping very quickly as well. So this is getting into the Evoy group headed down from the pass and headed into this terrain right at the end of October, and they're already starting to get some light snow flurries in the mountains. So suddenly they're looking at snow blanketing the mountains ahead of them. And as they're making this month-long trip through the Sierras, they're suddenly hit by snowstorm after snowstorm after snowstorm. And things are getting really desperate. At one point, they had the last of their oxen froze to death. So they had to abandon their wagons, collect whatever they could carry, which was not an awful lot. You can imagine a lot of them were very weak as it was. The women in the group, Bridget and her two daughters, Ellen and Margaret, it's kind of funny. They took all their dresses and just put them on top of the other, which served two purposes. One, it was less they had to carry in their arms, and the other was that it was dropping down into the low 30s at night. The water was freezing in their water cask. And like I say, they weren't, like anyone back in this period of time, they didn't have high-tech winter clothing. They weren't prepared for this, not at all. They didn't expect to be put in a situation. It was in fact, everything they'd done during this entire trip was tailored towards avoiding this kind of situation and getting through the mountains early enough they wouldn't have to deal with snow. So it was a very, very bad turn of luck. So the Evoy women were dressed up, and here's another quote from the book. "Dressed to the nines and liberated of most of their belongings, the Evoy women steeled their nerves and made the final push to get out of the mountains. In this deadly winter wonderland, the frail and timid, weaker sex of the Victorian conception was nowhere in evidence." So it's just a tongue-in-cheek way of pointing out that these women were as tough as anybody, any man, and they tolerated incredible conditions and hardships, physical, mental, and emotional, during this entire ordeal. And this idea that Victorian society promoted the idea that women were timid, frail, and not able to tolerate much adversity. And these talking points justified patriarchy. I'm sure that patriarchy was the thing that came along first, and then the talking points followed to justify it. And I think most people probably saw it as absurd, and it was. So these women were they were as tough as anybody. So 1849, they arrived in the Sacramento Valley in December. There's a lot of rain going on. Everything was muddy. A lot of the miners who had arrived were sick, and so they tried to recover in the squalor of these encampments, basically just in the dirt and mud. And a lot of them couldn't get up into the Sierras right away because the streams were swollen, the trails were far too muddy, and it was a problem. So the Evoy family, they had heard about this settlement that had just opened up where modern day Yuba City and Marysville are at. Now, those two cities are on opposite sides of the Feather River, right where the Feather joins the Yuba. And a couple of guys came up from Sacramento in the summer of 1849, about 5 months before the Evoys arrived, and they platted off an area in the dirt and built a crude trading post, and they started offering up parcels for sale for these miners and some merchants who were coming in. And the Evoy group were amongst the very first group of merchants to arrive there. Anybody who'd been there before them were just miners coming through. So this was both Yuba City and Marysville were just essentially uh, just dirt area with a lot of crude lodgepole and canvas structures built there, and the trading post was on one side and little crude structures on the other. So the Evoys, what they decided to do was Bridget and her daughter Ellen decided they bought land in Yuba City and set up a trading post. And the idea was that they weren't going to go after the gold; they were going to supply supplies for the miners who would need picks and shovels and whatnot, and they might need a place to sleep. So they also took in boarders. Um, Let me see here. So Bridget and Ellen settled in Yuba City, and they were basically serving as merchants initially and started buying parcels of land. Bridget's other daughter, Margaret, and her husband, John McCourtney, they heard of there was a horse trail that came down and it crossed the Bear River and it headed up into this mining region that had just opened up. Also, really crude mining camps where future Nevada City and Grass Valley are at. So they thought, well, there's a horse trail that goes over the Bear River. When the Bear River is flowing hard, you can't cross the river, so that cuts off access to the mining settlements. So what they did is they bought some land right where the horse trail crossed the river. They built a toll bridge, and that created a year-round access to this really important mining region, which was, the Grass Valley, Nevada City area was one of the most important mining regions in the northern part of the state at that point, growing rapidly. And so while Bridget and her daughter Ellen were making a lot of money very quickly as merchants in Yuba City, Margaret and John began making a lot of money with this toll bridge. So Margaret and John also built a trading post, a boarding house. They opened up a blacksmith shop because John McCourtney had some blacksmithing skills, and they opened up a lumber mill to supply lumbers to the settlements. So essentially, with Bridget and Ellen centered in Yuba City, where it was basically a river port where all these people would come up on boats from Sacramento City. Miners would get off there, and other people like merchants and tradespeople would get disembarked right there at Yuba City, and then they'd head up into the gold region. And so that was a strategic location, and that's why Bridget and Ellen chose that location to establish themselves. Meanwhile, Margaret and John also chose a strategic location where a major access route crossed the Bear River. So they were extremely strategic on how they set themselves up in this whole scenario. Really smart and forward thinking. Here's a nice little etching. This was done in 1851, which shows the waterfront in Marysville. By now, the town is expanding very quickly. Now that you have, rather than lodgepole and canvas structures, you now have wood structures, still some tents, but real lively scene. A lot of boats are coming up, hauling up merchandise, which will be bought by the merchants and resold at a markup, like Bridget and Ellen were doing. And the miners, this is where everybody disembarked and they headed right up into the mining regions. So they needed supplies, maybe a warm meal, a place to sleep, and they were taken care of by these merchants who were set up there. Nice little quote. Men plunge wildly into every mode of dissipation to drown the homesickness so often gnawing at their hearts. They sang, they danced, they drank and caroused all night and worked all day. They were possessed of the demon of recklessness. Luzina Stanley Wilson. This woman ran, like Bridget, ran a boarding house right there in Marysville. Probably, in fact, I'm sure they knew each other. There weren't a lot of women there in that first year or two of the gold rush. Exhibit A, these were their customers. So Ellen, Bridget's daughter, who, by the way, was my great-great-grandmother. So this is my direct connection to this story, was through Bridget's daughter, Ellen. Ellen is a 21-year-old single woman. As soon as they established a land office, which was essentially a tent, they opened up a book and they started recording the very first properties that were purchased in Yuba City. This is in February of 1850. The family had only been there for just a couple of months. They'd already started buying land. And so when the recording office opened up, I went and found the original book in the land office in Yuba City. And Ellen's was the third entry in that book. She was the third person to buy land in that area. And she did it as a single 21-year-old woman, which was really unusual for, it was still the California territory at that point. It wasn't even a state. Pretty remarkable, and also really a sign of her independence. She didn't partner with Bridget, her mother. She did it on her own. And so Ellen and her mother started buying parcels in the community and elsewhere in Yuba County and Sutter County, and began flipping properties because this area was booming. It was growing very rapidly. So the value of land was going up very quickly as well. So they sort of emphasized buying and selling land. They were actually offering up mortgages to people, and they would charge an interest rate, which was compounded every month. And they were leasing land and they were renting land. So they had all kinds of things going on. And of course, Bridget's other daughter, Margaret, and her husband, John, were really diversifying their entrepreneurial efforts as well. Like I said, they had lodging, they had general merchandise, they had their toll bridge, which was always a great thing, and soon that route would be a stagecoach route, which was very lucrative as well, because it was their little establishment was a stage stop. This is just an example of one of these towns that was built rapidly and pretty chaotic, and all the trees cut down, and it was pretty much chaos. There was no planning going on. So Bridget, after a couple of years, is 1853, she decided one of the things she would do is she would keep her ear to the ground and try to find out about what boom towns were opening up, what mining areas were suddenly showing promise, which meant that everybody would be heading there soon. So she heard about a place called Briggsville. It was up in Shasta County, about, I don't know, 50 miles north of Marysville. She went up there and she bought a parcel of land in this little mining settlement. This was really primitive, way out in the middle of nowhere, just off the Clear Creek area of South Shasta County. And so she had a crude boarding house built, also a lodgepole, pine, and canvas structure. And so she started taking in customers. She would set up some cots, or in some cases they would just throw their bedroll on the ground, and they'd pay for room. And then also they would, the women, Bridget and her daughter Ellen, would cook meals. And so these miners could get a place to sleep and a cooked meal. It was quite a luxury in this really primitive camp. So Bridget she called this place California House, and she ran this for about a year or so, and she made a lot of money quickly. And in the mining area, because everybody rushed in there so quickly, and a lot of people spent what little money they had getting to California, a lot of people arrived here without money, figuring they could just go and dig up some gold and then they could get money that way. Well, there really wasn't much in the way of currency. So quickly, the practice was to use gold dust as currency. So if you're a miner, you dug up some gold and you wanted to pay room and board or get some supplies, you'd take a little pinch of gold dust out of your satchel and put it on a little plate at the merchant's counter, and that's how you paid for things. So you paid by the pinch, and that was a way of measuring a volume of gold and therefore a value. So that was really the currency in the Motherlode region, was gold dust. So Bridget, like everybody else, would accumulate gold dust. She'd keep it in bags and hide it. And after she accumulated a certain amount, she would have to go take a long stage ride into Marysville, where the nearest bank was at, and deposit it so that it was secured in a vault. You wouldn't want to keep that kind of thing around in your, place of in your home or in your business in these mining communities. There was too much opportunity for people to rob you. So Bridget accumulated about, it was $1,800 in gold dust. That's 1853 money that would be worth many times that now. That's a significant amount of gold dust for a widow who's pushing 60. She was about 61 years old, 62 years old. She had to take this stuff on a long overnight stage ride into Marysville, and she had a carpet bag. She had all this gold dust in a couple of satchels inside her carpet bag, and this was probably very heavy for her to carry. This little Irish woman trying to lug this thing onto a stage. And so she took the stage, and during this trip, a man got on, older gentleman by the name of John Harper, and had just recently been a state senator representing 2 counties in Northern California, and was now out of office. But he was, an influential member of the community, of the region, really well known. He carried himself well spoken, fairly well educated as well. So he sat next to her, and during this long trip, they talked a lot, and she got really comfortable and decided she let her guard down a little bit. And when they got to a ranch, to water the horses and let the stage passengers, go to the ranch house, get water, maybe some food. Bridget went in there and asked Colonel Harper if he wouldn't mind watching her carpet bag, keeping an eye on it. And he said, sure, he can do that. And he stayed in the stagecoach. So she came back about, I don't know, half an hour later or so. And when she picked up her carpet bag, she noticed that its weight was different. Something was off. So she looked inside and saw that her 2 satchels that had been full of gold dust were gone. And now there are rocks in their place inside the carpet bag. Heavy rocks that weighed roughly similar to what the gold had been. Now, this Colonel Harper had been supposedly watching this thing and in the stage the whole time, that he claimed. So she immediately questioned him, and he started to make a big deal about this, and he objected to even the insinuation that there might be something afoot here. She didn't believe him, so she really went after him verbally. There was this big confrontation. All the passengers gathered around and watched the spectacle. A sheriff was called, and during this heated argument, Colonel Harper tossed his jacket down and offered, he said, "If you believe I've taken your gold, please search me." But when he threw his coat down on the ground, it hit the ground with a heavy thud. One of the passengers thought this was odd, so he picked up the jacket, and indeed it was unusually heavy. He reached into the pocket, and here were the two satchels of gold dust that he had stolen out of Bridget's carpet bag. So a sheriff was called. They went to a local ranch and they were interrogated. And Colonel Harper didn't have a good explanation for how this gold dust got into his pockets. And he really incriminated himself and said a lot of things. He offered up a lot of irrational arguments. And so the sheriff believed Bridget. He was arrested and he was sent to San Quentin prison. I believe this is 1853. I think one of the earliest inmates there. And so this was sensational because here you have a prominent member of society, well respected, who apparently had taken advantage of this old woman and robbed her of her gold, and wouldn't admit to it. And so this got made it news in all the papers in the area, in the Northern California area, and it even made it into the New York Times. A lot of people didn't believe this were possible and thought maybe somebody else had done this and it wasn't him. But if you read the book, the evidence was very incriminating. It was clearly him. So a lot of people, though, still hung on stubbornly to this idea that he had been framed. But what's interesting is a couple years later, the new governor, Governor Bigler, had commuted his sentence. And so he immediately left the United States and went to Nicaragua and never came back. So his innocence was highly questionable, I think. About 1853, not long after this incident, Bridget had gathered all the accumulated gold dust that she had made from her boarding house and some of her property transactions. She owned some property in San Francisco as well as in Santa Clara. So coming down to do some business in the Bay Area, she realized that the East Bay area was starting to be looked at as an area to settle for farming and ranching cattle. A lot of, vast open acreage, part of these large Spanish land grants, but people were buying parcels, some were squatting and creating these ranches and farms. So Bridget thought that this seemed like a really good opportunity for her. And, she had been a farmer in the past, so this wasn't anything new for her. So she went to the Peraltas. Vicente Peralta was the land grant holder, and he lived in the north, just north of what was the small city of Oakland. He had an adobe up there. And this figure at the top of the page, you'll see Vicente Peralta's adobe is shown there. And Temescal Creek is just alongside his adobe. And so Bridget bought 100 acres of land with her gold dust. And you could see the land is located along what was called Road to Peralta and later Telegraph Road, eventually Telegraph Avenue. And so she was that area, which is now North Oakland, was a really entirely rural area. Hardly anybody lived up there, just a few large ranches separated by large distances. And if you wanted to go from where Bridget's land was to what was, downtown Oakland, it took maybe half a day, and you'd take your horse down there, and it was a rough, rutted dirt road all the way. Telegraph Avenue was. And I think the population of Oakland in 1853 was maybe 1,000 people or something like that, maybe a little bit more than that, really small. But Bridget was one of she was a pioneering citizen of what would become Oakland as early as 1853, and amongst the first few dozen people who lived in that particular area north of Oakland. And she was made good friends with the Peralta family, who were her immediate neighbors. Here we have Bridget's land is shown in this pink pattern. And so that's, her land superimposed onto modern metropolitan Oakland. And she bought that 100 acres of land for about $3,000 in 1853, which was $3,000 then was an awful lot of money. You could imagine the millions and millions of dollars this land would be worth now if the family had held on to it. The orange parcel that's adjoining it, just on the east, was her daughter Margaret, later on relocated to the Temescal district of Oakland and bought that land. So between Bridget and her daughter, they owned 157 acres of land in what would become part of this major metropolis of Oakland. Bridget, once again, was very prescient about the future, how things were going to change, and what she should do to try to capitalize on that as far as the value of her land and income. So she knew that at some point in the late 1850s, early 1860s, the city of Oakland started to develop a transportation system, which is essentially horse-drawn wagons. And they had a line, it was planned to go up Telegraph Avenue or Telegraph Road, and they had another line that would come from the waterfront at the bay's edge where the ferry came over. They had a pier there. People would get off at the pier and they'd get on one of these carriages and they would take it to the east. So, and they would it would become part of this network. And so Bridget decided to offer the city of Oakland an easement along the south edge of her property and along the east edge of her property for this key route system, is what the city called it, this transportation system. Smart because it meant that these travelers, not only did that create a local transportation system which kind of attracted residential development, but it also brought these passengers by the fronts of their properties where they could offer up parcels for sale. And they also had some of their family-run businesses along these main roads. So it brought in potentially customers. So she and Margaret both dedicated parts of their land right along the edge of them to the city, and this key route system was routed right by their property. So this map on the left, that red rectangle, is Bridget's property. You can see how it's situated with these solid black lines are the key route system routes. So they are ideally situated for growth, both residential value and the commercial growth along their property fronting these roads. Eventually, after Margaret settled there, so Margaret is this portrait in the lower left is Margaret McCourtney. That's Bridget's older daughter. Margaret, in the meanwhile, had been branching out and buying land and further afield. She was investing in all kinds of commercial ventures. She was investing in mining stock in other states. She had land in San Francisco, land in Contra Costa County, and the mountain range, the Berkeley Hills, essentially. She had land she bought in the Delta region. It was reclaimed land where they grew hay and ranged cattle. She just had so many things going on. She was an incredibly versatile entrepreneur. And she did this, she was married, but she did all this business was done independent of her husband. She was doing all of this in her own name. So her mother's independence and her mother's attitude about doing business was something she passed on to both daughters, Ellen and Margaret. And they both were very versatile because of this. So Margaret became quite wealthy, probably more so than her mother, but she decided to give back to the community. So what she did was she dedicated her home to an institute for what was called then deaf, dumb, and blind. And so she opened up her home, and these people could go and stay there and be cared for. And they taught them, how to communicate and all that there. And then also at the same time, both Margaret and her sister Ellen decided to help the Catholic Church, they were very tight with the Catholic Church. They decided to help them establish a new parish called the Sacred Heart Parish. There were no churches in North Oakland at the time, and initially Ellen offered her home, and they'd hold services in the front parlor of their home. They started gathering money together. The family contributed some money. They did special events to try to get the contributions from the public together to build a church. So they built the Sacred Heart Church in Oakland with this money. So the family helped establish the church. They were essential in doing that. Joseph Alemany, the Archbishop from San Francisco, partnered with them on this and helped establish the church. So they were giving back to the community, even though they gained a lot of wealth, they never really lost touch with the family's beginnings in Ireland, which was as, working class. They did still value the plight of working class people and became very, very influential. 1867, Bridget lived a long life, very full, and eventually she succumbed to an illness. This is 1867. She was 76 years old. Quite a long life for somebody born in the 1790s, actually, and had such a hard life. So this is a large marble slab that was put on a family mausoleum, and this is located within the Peralta grave plot, a large grave plot. So Bridget was very close to the Peralta family, and the Peraltas had the very first, it's plot number 1. They had the very first plot in the St. Mary's Cemetery, a historic cemetery. I think it was established in 1865. So Bridget was one of the earliest people interned there. And this, in the Celtic tradition, a prominent member of a community would be buried up on a prominent piece of land that overlooked their community, typically. So the St. Mary's Cemetery, even though now it has a lot of eucalyptus groves around it, so you can't see the view as well as you could originally, it overlooks the Temescal district where Bridget had her ranch, and it also overlooks the North Bay area, including the area of the Golden Gate. So a quote from the book: Bridget's final resting place overlooks her Temescal ranch and, quite appropriately, offers a sweeping view of the storied entrance to the San Francisco Bay. The Golden Gate, the distant, oft fog-shrouded gateway to the bay, represented the threshold to a land of promise and perhaps a symbolic reminder of Bridget's risky gambit for renewal and opportunity in the West. This is a view of the Golden Gate opening before they built the bridge. I wasn't aware, naively, I always thought of the Golden Gate as a bridge, a structure, but actually for decades and decades, it was a landmark. It was the opening to the San Francisco Bay, called the Golden Gate for obvious reasons. And so Bridget's final resting place had this view a little further distance away. So this was really, to me, very ironic and fitting for her final resting place. And that's my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
What a great presentation.
There we go.
Oh, thank you.
That was extremely interesting. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank
I should
you.
mention before I
Thank you
forget.
so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. I should I should mention before I forget, if anybody wants to get the book, Bridget's Gambit, you can just go online to any web browser, type in the title, Bridget's Gambit, and it's offered in all the usual places, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and all kinds of online booksellers. The story, of course, is told in far greater detail in the book, and I had the advantage writing a book of bringing in the colorful characters and the color in the story, the drama and all of that, and really setting each scene as the story plays out. I had the luxury of doing all of that in writing a book. I can't do any of that in a presentation. I have to give it much more brief story here.
I bought the book. I thought it was really good.
Oh, great. Great.
And I was just surprised at the amount of research you did. The notes in the back of the book were just really, really helpful.
Yeah, it was done for the publisher's the University Press, and they normally do scholarly books. They're always well researched, and they have a very high standard for what they're willing to accept. So in this case, I'd already done a book with them several years ago. It did well, it was well received. And so I decided to do this book with them as well. But in this case, I was telling what I saw as more of a popular story. It wasn't a scholarly story. And so I wrote it in a more lively way, in a way that's supposed to be accessible for your average person. You don't have to be a scholar to enjoy the story. But at the same time, in order to publish it through a university press, I had to have that research really dialed in. So that's why it's kind of that, extensive research. At the same time, the storytelling is rather lively and accessible.
It's impressive. It really was.
Thank you.
Well, I don't see any more questions, but it was really a very, very good presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for allowing me to come on board and share my story.
It was great.
Oh, it was most interesting.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Have a good evening.